may be seated. Well, if you don't know me, I am Nathan Rymer. I'm the lead pastor here at Kara City Church. Glad you're here this morning. Before we get started with the sermon, I want to ask a favor. Remember a few weeks ago when we were getting ready to move into this new facility that was much bigger, and I said there's some risk for us because it's a lot more effort to get us ready on Sunday mornings. So we go to the old chapel and everything's set up. We just got to go plug a few things in. We're ready, move a TV, and we're ready to roll. But here, at 7 o'clock this morning, this was a gym. And by 9:15, it's a worship sanctuary. And so I want to ask for your help. If some of you would agree to be a part of our setup and tear down teams, that would be awesome. We need your help because the guys that are doing it, they were all sweating this morning, not just because it was hot, but there weren't quite enough of them. So if you'd be willing to do that, if you would let us know, we'd love to expand that team to make it easier. Same thing, tear down team at the end of this service. We'd love you to be a part of that. The other place we could really use your help is in children's ministry. Teaching or assisting there would be awesome. So as we grow, we just want to make sure that we are serving the way we want so that new people have the experience that we want them to have. So hopefully they come back and give Jesus another chance. So anyway, let's get started. When Winston Churchill was talking about the commitment of England to win World War II, he said these words: "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills." That also sounds like a pretty good description of some of our family vacations. We fought on beaches. We fought in the mountains. We fought on trains and planes. We fought on boats. We fought near moats. We fought in cars. We fought over jars. We've even fought over about Hollywood stars. Our fights could be a Dr. Seuss book over the years if you didn't pick up on the rhyming that was going on there. My wife and I have been married for 33 years this summer. We have 4 kids, oldest 25, youngest 17. And it's fair to say that over the years, we've had conflict and disagreement. Now, what I can absolutely say is that our conflicts and disagreements today are a lot less often. They're a lot less serious, and there's longer periods of time between them, and they don't last as long. But that wasn't always the case. And so I want to tell you a little bit, something I haven't told a group this big. I've never said from the stage before, a little bit about our history. Lil and I were married when we were 20 years old. We were still kids in college, and I remember telling my mom that we were getting married, and she said no. I'm like, "No, I don't think you understand how this works. This is more of a courtesy than really a request for permission." And she said, "Well, Lil's mature enough to get married, but I don't think you are." Now that hurt a little, and it upset me at the time, but in hindsight, she's probably right. But once she understood we were going to get married, she got excited about helping with the wedding, and so everything was great, and everything was great when we got married. At that time, we were still in college, and we were really just 2 kids playing house in college. So for the first few years, it was awesome. But by year 4, things had changed a little bit. We had moved from Nacogdoches, where we went to school at SFA. Lila dropped out of school to support us financially. I was now a full-time student at law school here in Houston. And we went from 2 kids playing house with no stress, really no bills of any sort other than college housing, to suddenly we were going in debt. We couldn't afford to live. We had all of the real world affecting us. But probably more than that, we had grown from being the kids that we said I do with to the adults that we felt a little stuck with, if you want to be real honest about that, because we were not who we were going to be. And at this point, we started to struggle in about 4 years, and we started to fight more often, and our fights became more serious, and they lasted longer, and we began to say mean things to one another. And eventually, we started threatening each other with divorce and separation. At first, it was just to hurt one another to try to win the fight, but over time, it just kind of became what we thought might be the inevitable conclusion of our marriage. By year 7, things got near rock bottom at that point. I was now a young lawyer working 70, 80 hours a week, and candidly, my number one goal in life was to be rich and famous. And I was working really hard. I was having a lot of success in trial. I was getting to do things that young lawyers my age didn't get to do, and all that went to my head. And I became hard to live with because I was convinced that all my problems and all the things I was going through were way more important than what Lil was going through. Law school also taught me to argue really well, and I was good at it. So I could take Lil's words and I could twist her and I could cross-examine her and I could get her crying and admitting it was her fault. And I thought I was winning. But then Lil stopped crying as much and she began to become bitter and disillusioned about our marriage. What I didn't know is she had begun saving secretly to have money so that when she left me, she'd have money to live on. I remember we had a big fight, and it went from fighting to serious, and she told me she was moving out of the apartment that weekend. And so she was gathering up and getting ready to go, and I decided to go up to Northeast Texas where I'm from and my parents live to break it to my parents that Lil and I were separating. And they were devastated. I mean, they were hurt for me, knowing how bad I was hurting. They were also sad because over the dating relationship and marriage, Lil had been a part of their life for the last 9 years. And so we prayed together, we cried together, we talked about fighting for our marriage, and I wasn't sure that Lil would even give me a chance. But what I didn't know is when I was driving back to Houston, my mom called my wife Lil and begged her to give it one more chance and to fight for her marriage. So as I got close to Houston, Lil called me on the phone and said she'd be waiting for me at the apartment. When I got there, we talked for hours about what it would look like to do things differently. And we decided to keep fighting for our marriage. And over the next few months, things slowly got better, and to the point we decided to have our first kid together, and that was Ashley. 25 years ago she was born. And things were better, but they still weren't great. Let's be honest, it took years of learning how to fight fair. It took years of learning how to treat one another the way we should, so that eventually we went from having a marriage that brought us sadness and frustration to having a marriage that brings us joy and happiness. And now at almost 33 years, we're best friends. We love to hang out. We love to laugh. We're bonded together in unity against the common enemy of our kids. We're excited about what we'll do when the kids are all gone, which is getting close, where we'll be empty nesters. But there was about 7 years where it was ugly. There was not big old happily ever after for either one of us. It was a work in progress. And I say that and tell you that story because if you're sitting here thinking your marriage is a big old train wreck and that the preacher doesn't know what you're going through, you're wrong. I do. Lil and I have been where you are. We've had the same hurt and struggles. I know the pain and the bitterness and the trapped feeling that you have. And I want you to know that. I really believe from my own experience and from talking to other people that the only difference between couples that stay together for a lifetime and couples that get divorced is how they respond to the difficult season. What do they decide to do? Because I believe that almost every marriage goes through a period of months or a period of years where there is going to be difficulty, there's going to be heartache, there's going to be sadness in that moment. And the difference is the couples that decide to stay together and the couples that decide to get divorced. In getting ready for this sermon, I discovered that research actually supports this idea that I have. There was a University of Chicago sociologist named Dr. Linda Waite, and she conducted a study along with her team of 5,232 married adults. Of those surveyed, 645 initially said they were unhappily married. So what they did is they took this big survey, found those 645 people, and then they waited 5 years. And they went back and they talked to the exact same individuals again to see where they were 5 years later. Of the people they talked to that were unhappy, 5 years later, 2/3 of the people who stayed together said they were now happily married. But they didn't just talk to the people that stayed together, they also talked to the group that was unhappy and got a divorce somewhere in that period. And what they found was that of the people that were unhappy and got a divorce, only 1 in 5, or 20%, was now happily married. What they also found is even the ones that had gotten a divorce and gotten remarried, they were just as likely to be unhappy in their second marriage as the people that stayed with their first marriage. And what that tells us is the bottom line is that a divorce in a difficult situation is a whole lot less likely to make you happy 5 years later than struggling through the difficult season. We're in the second week of our sermon series, Love Stuff, where we're talking about how we can improve relationships with the people that are close to us. Last week we looked at Ephesians 5 and we talked about marriage and how that passage of Scripture can improve our marriage. And I really believe if you apply the truth from Ephesians chapter 5, it can make a good marriage even better, but it can also transform a difficult marriage and make it into a good marriage. And so if you weren't here last week and you missed that sermon, I'd really encourage you to go back. You can watch it on Facebook or you can watch it on our website. Go back and watch that because I really believe that the truth from Ephesians 5 can make a difference in your life. Well, this week we're talking about conflict, not just in marriage, but we're talking about conflict in relationships that are important to us. And as I was getting ready for this, I thought, man, I sure wish Lil and I would have heard a sermon like this all those years ago. Maybe we could have avoided a lot of difficulty and heartache and learning by trial and error. But I want to share some of those truths with you and some of those practical ideas so that hopefully you don't have to go through some of the pain and the heartache that we went through. Now, a lot of these practical tips and a lot of these applications apply to more than just marriage. A lot of these apply to parent-child conflict or conflict between siblings or conflict between close friends. There's a few, and you'll know what they are, that apply just to marriage. But I really believe that you will deal with conflict in close relationships. Every close relationship will have disagreement, it will have arguments, and the closer we are, the more likely we are to have that conflict on a more frequent basis. And when we live in the same house together, the potential for conflict goes up exponentially. And so it's very important for us to understand how to deal with that conflict, how to resolve those disagreements in a way that makes sense so that we can have marriages that bring us joy and we can have family relationships that bring us happiness for years to come. All right, let me start with this question, though. How many of you go way out of your way to avoid any type of confrontation or disagreement with someone else, even when you probably need to? People? Yeah, there's quite a few. I was actually in a young adult Bible study a few weeks ago, and we were talking about conflict, and I asked, confrontation, good or bad? And most of them said bad. And I said, all the time? And they're like, yeah, all the time. That's not true. Confrontation, disagreement is a part of life. It's not even a part of Christian life. The Bible actually tells us that we need to confront people in certain circumstances. Confrontation, disagreement, discussion is neither good nor bad. It depends on, one, what's the purpose, and two, how do you handle it? Listen to what the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 6:1. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourself, or you may also be tempted. Now that's a specific instruction in the Bible to confront someone who's caught in sin. And that could potentially lead to conflict. Think about what Jesus did. Jesus initiated conflict with the Jewish religious leaders. And if Jesus was involved in conflict, it can't be bad because Jesus was perfect. It's better to talk about our disagreements. If we have problems in our marriage or problems in our relationship with other people, it's better to talk about those, talk about our disagreements, try to work those out than it is to just let frustration build to the point where you no longer want that relationship or it explodes. Real relationships are built on honest communication in love. Let me say that again because I think that's a big deal that we can all learn. Real relationships are built on honest communication in love. Honest communication should involve encouragement and praise, but it should also involve discussion of things that we don't agree with and things that we don't like. But when we have those difficult conversations and arguments, we have to understand this truth. Words are powerful. Words can bring life. Words can bring death. Listen how the Bible says this in Proverbs 18:21. It says, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. That sounds really cool, but you're like, well, what does that even mean? Look at how the Message paraphrases this same verse. Words kill, words give life. They're either poison or fruit. You choose. Words are powerful. They can bring life. They can bring death. Listen to how it says this. Proverbs 12:18 says it. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the words of the wise bring healing. That's just a fraction of what the Bible has to say about the power of the words that we use. Because words bring life and death, joy and pain, healing and hurt. And I'm not sure that's true in any relationship more than it is in marriage. We have to understand as married couples how to use words. Communication when things are going well to encourage and love one another. But even more important, understanding how words can tear each other down and hurt us when we're dealing with conflict. Now, this doesn't just apply to marriages. It applies to all kinds of relationships, but I think it's especially true in marriage. All right, with that understanding of what the Bible has to say about how powerful the words that we use are, let's get started with how to deal with conflict in relationships. Here's the primary takeaway for handling conflict. The goal is resolution, not victory. It's huge to understand. The goal isn't to win the argument. The goal is to resolve whatever disagreement you have. That's so important to understand. If that's the only thing you take away from this message, it can change your relationship with someone else if you begin to view disagreements and conflict that way. Conflict is not an MMA fight. The goal isn't for a knockout. Husbands and wives, the goal in a fight is not to get the victor's flag, but sleep on the couch in the victor's spot for the next 3 nights. You can win an argument. You can convince the other person that they're wrong. You can make them feel horrible. You can have them crying. And then you deal with hurt and bitterness and frustration. You've heard the old saying, you can win the battle and lose the war. That's absolutely true when it comes to handling conflict in relationships with people we love. The goal is to find resolution. The goal is to find a place where you're both happy again. It's not to win. Man, this took Lil and I 15 years to really understand. We're both stubborn. And she's got this problem where she really likes to win, which makes it difficult. I'm not that way at all. I really hate to lose. That's my deal. And so when you put, those two together, it does not end well because we wanted to win. But the goal is resolution, and I so wish we'd have known that and figured that out early. Once we did, our fights became less frequent, less painful, and they didn't last nearly as long. Listen to what the author of Hebrews says about this in Hebrews 12:14 through 15. It says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. So find peace. Look at verse 15. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Here's what it's saying. The goal of conflict, the goal with everyone, including our spouse, including the people that are most important to us, is to return to unity and peace, to find peace. That's the goal of that disagreement. And to avoid bitterness. The goal of conflict is to return to peace and unity and to keep bitterness from growing. And when we understand that, then we want to fight more fair with one another because we want to try to resolve the conflict. But how do we do that? How do we fight fair? Well, let me give you some practical tips about how to fight fair and to better argue in a way that brings resolution and less bitterness. Now, I've got several don'ts and a couple of do's, and the do's are really important when we get to those. But here's the first don't. Don't bring up past mistakes. So often when we argue, we want to dredge up things that were done in the past because we have the wrong perspective on the argument. We want to win, and we know that bringing up some of those old things can help us win. This is especially true when we think we may be at fault or we're wrong in this specific situation. So what do? We just go, let's not focus on this. Let's go look back at something that happened before. Well, you think I'm being mean to you? Do you remember when you yelled at me 6 months ago? Do you remember when you locked me out of the house in the great marriage rites of 2017? We dredge all those things up because we want to win, but that's not the goal of the disagreement. Bringing up past mistakes and wrongs, it doesn't help you resolve whatever you're going through now. It just hurts one another. Here's the thing, and I know it's difficult, but if you can do it, it will change everything. Focus on what the disagreement is now. Now, maybe the disagreement goes back several days or several weeks. It's okay to talk about this particular disagreement, but don't start dredging up other things because all you're doing is trying to hurt the other one. Here's the problem with that. The more you drag along this baggage of the past, the more it weighs down your marriage, the more it weighs down your relationship. And you keep bringing up things that happened months or years ago, and so it feels like it's all very fresh. It keeps the wounds open. It makes people think that things that happened a year ago are still happening because you keep talking about them. Look at what the Apostle Paul says about this when he's describing what true love is in 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 5. He says, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. It's a big deal. Listen how this same truth is said by the great theologian, Timon from The Lion King. Timon says, you got to put your behind in your past. The more you bring up past mistakes, the more you're just dragging this old baggage along in your relationship. You constantly remind each other of the hurt you've caused, and it makes it worse. So to fight fair, when you argue, fight in the present, not the past. Here's another important practical way to fight fair. Don't confuse disagreement with lies. I think we have a real tendency to do that. We believe the other person's lying to us. So here's the thing. You may be thinking back to some discussion you had a few hours ago, a few days ago, and you remember it differently. Or you remember who said what in the right order. Have you ever had fights about what order things were said to one another in? You may have a different perspective on what's right and fair in the relationship. But that doesn't mean that someone's lying. When you're talking about something that happened hours ago or days ago, it may not be that they're lying. It may just be that they're wrong. Or it might even be that you're wrong, as crazy as that might sound. One of the things I've learned as a litigation attorney is you can have a car wreck and you can have 3 independent witnesses who have nothing to do with the wreck. They just happen to be standing somewhere or sitting in a car and watched it happen. If you have 3 independent witnesses, you will almost certainly get 3 different stories about what happened. They're not lying. They don't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. They just saw it a little differently from a different angle. They've kind of forgotten what happened, and they don't remember it correctly. So when you're arguing about something that happened a few days or a few weeks ago, don't accuse someone of lying, because more than likely, it's just they misremember or you misremember. This can also happen with opinions about the past. This happens a lot in marriage where, let me give you an example. You can tell me, don't tell me, if this happens in your relationship. The husband says, it feels like we don't have sex as much. Over the last year, we haven't had sex nearly as often as we have in years past. Oh, and it makes you mad. And you know that's not right. And so your reaction is, that's a lie. But here's the thing, it's probably not a lie. Because to really call it a lie, you would have to have kept track of how many times you've had sex, specifically in the last 365 days, and done a comparative study of the last 365 days versus the years prior to that. You probably haven't done that, so you can't say it's lying. If you have kept track like that, you need to get a hobby. You need something else to do. And even if your spouse is wrong about it, for it to be a lie, they would have had to keep track for the last 365 days of exactly how many times you've had sex and keep track of the times before that and then do a comparative study for you about how that compares and do that inaccurately. And if they've kept track like that, they need a hobby. Somebody in your marriage needs a hobby. Even if your spouse is wrong, doesn't mean it's a lie. It means it's a different perspective on the same thing. So be very careful about using the words lie, lying, and liar. If lying is a problem in your marriage, and you need to deal with that specifically, you need to have a conversation about lying. Not accuse lying in a conversation or an argument about something different. But be very careful about using those words, because all they do is escalate the fight and cause hurt and bitterness. All right, here's the next strategy for resolving conflict. Don't go to bed angry. Now, this is one that some experts actually disagree with. Some experts say that you shouldn't go to bed angry. Some say you should go on to bed, get a good night's rest, and get up and continue the disagreement in the morning. My experience has been there is no good night's rest. So I tend to side with the experts that say, before you go to bed, before you go to sleep, if you can possibly resolve that conflict, resolve the conflict. Here's what the Bible says in Ephesians 4:26 through 27. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. It's better to resolve a fight sooner rather than later, because the longer a fight goes, the more bitterness there's going to be, there's more anger and hurt. And so try to resolve that as you go. Here's my personal experience on this. In the times when Lil and I have gone to bed angry and we've slept in a different room or slept in the same bed, flipped different ways, all mad at one another, you've been there, you've done that probably. And if you hadn't, we need to go back and talk about lying again. We can do that in a different sermon. But here's the thing. I don't sleep very much. And I wake up the next morning and I'm still angry about whatever we were fighting about. Plus, now I'm angry too that she kept me from having a good night's sleep, and now I got to go to work feeling horrible. My experience is that if a fight continues overnight, it's certainly going to continue through the next day and into the next evening as well. Now look, this doesn't mean that you can't take a little time to cool down. If you feel like a fight's getting escalated, it's getting out of control, the tempers are flaring, you can take a little time to cool off, to rethink about how do we try to resolve this conflict. And guys, let me take this opportunity to say, there is never, ever a reason for you to use your physical size or your physical strength as a weapon in fighting. We're told to love our wives like Christ loved the church. And if you ever use physical intimidation or physical strength in an argument, you're not loving your wife like Christ loved the church, and there is no excuse for that. But take a little time if you need to. Let things calm down, but don't let the fight go on. If it takes several hours for you to calm down, or my goodness, several days, bitterness is setting in. Disagreements need to be resolved quickly so that you can move on. For husbands and wives, make-up sex is okay. It's actually a good thing. And ladies, this is not opinion, this is science. I'm fixing to tell you why. First of all, it's hard to stay angry at somebody when you're having that level of physical intimacy with them. But what we've learned from science is that sex releases a drug called dopamine in our brains. And dopamine works as an antidepressant, a painkiller, and a stress reliever. Those are all great things for getting past an argument and resolving conflict and anger. God gave us sex in marriage to bond us together. He gave it to us as a tool so that we could become one. And in those moments, sex becomes something that helps us deal with the stress of the world around us, but also the stress of conflict in our marriage. Here's the next thing to make sure you're fighting fair and working towards resolution. Don't bluff. Now, bluffing is a big part of poker, but bluffing should not be a part of disagreements you have with people you love. Now, I love every once in a while I'll get on TV and I'll watch the Texas Hold'em tournaments. Y'all ever watch professional Texas Hold'em tournaments? And I love it because you'll be watching and they'll be betting little bets, somebody with $5,000, $6,000, whatever it is, with chips. I don't know how much it really is. And then you'll have somebody go with their big pile of chips, I'm all in. And what they're saying in that moment is they're willing to put everything on the line for this one moment. And that's a great strategy in poker. It's a horrible strategy in arguing with people we love. In poker, this person, they may have a full house, and so they've got a great hand, but they may just have a pair of twos, and they're bluffing, and they're saying, I'm willing to go home right now over this one moment. So how do we do that in marriage? Well, here's one way we bluff and we go all in. Well, let's just get a divorce. Maybe you can find somebody better. I'll just leave, or you just leave. We say those things, and really what we're saying in that moment is, I hear your argument about how I'm not loving you well, or I hear your argument about how I'm not respecting you well, but I'm going to raise you divorce. And we push all our chips in. But here's the problem with that. You actually may win the fight a couple of times. But I learned in my own marriage that you cause hurt, you cause anger, you cause bitterness and disillusionment. And the more you talk about getting a divorce or separating, the easier it is to start really thinking about doing it. The same type of bluffing, it can happen between parents and kids. That I'm out. And anger can also lead to decisions that you'll regret later. All right, here's the last don't for fighting fair. Don't use derogatory names or terms. We have a tendency sometimes when we fight to call each other names. You're a liar, or you're a jerk, or you're a bully. Women will do that. And guys, we have a tendency to sometimes have pet names for our wives. Let's say you call your wife Princess, and I'm not suggesting you do that. I think that's a horrible idea. Sorry if you actually do it. But then in a fight, you say, you know what? We want to win. We want to hurt the other person. And so we call them names. It doesn't resolve conflict. All it does is tear down and destroy. So don't do it. That's the list for the list of don'ts. Now, there are two do's in fighting fair. The first is do compromise. If the goal is resolution, not victory, then shouldn't we compromise? Shouldn't we try to find common ground where we can agree? So guys, if you always like the house to be at the perfect temperature of 54 degrees year-round, and your wife likes it a little closer to let's say, the temperature of the sun, find happy medium where you can both find compromise in that situation. Arguments over sex is a great way to find compromise for couples. You may disagree about how, and try to find middle ground. You can go back to last week, and we can talk to me. So I want to give you this. That's okay. We need to find compromise. We need to find things that we can work because the goal is to find common ground and move. But it may also be the most important. Do forgive. This is critical in any long-term relationships. The people you love will make mistakes. They will say things that hurt you. They will do things that tear you down. The question isn't will they, because they will. The real question is, how will you respond? Can you forgive? In a long-term relationship, we have to constantly forgive one another for wrongs, both real and imagined. The Bible talks a lot about forgiveness. You guys know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But here's what the Apostle Paul says in Colossians 3:13. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. What Paul's saying here is you forgive not because the person has said they're sorry, not because they've earned it, not because they've made it right. You forgive because you are forgiven so much by our God. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 18, he says that you should forgive another person how many times? 70 times 7. Now don't do the math because he wasn't wanting a math problem here. He was telling us forgive over and over and over. Jesus doesn't say forgive when it's not a big deal. He doesn't say forgive if they've tried to make it right and they've apologized. Jesus says forgive, period. He set the example. He was on the cross looking down at the very people who drove nails into his hands and his feet. And what did he say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know the pain they're causing me right now. That's what forgiveness looks like. I think growing up as kids, we have this very childlike understanding of forgiveness. And the problem is some of us haven't transformed from a childlike view of forgiveness to an adult view of forgiveness. Our childlike view of forgiveness kind of goes like this. There's two sides to forgiveness. There's the apology and the acceptance. Right? And if you've got little kids, you know how this works. There's someone apologizes, then someone says, I forgive you. Bobby, get over here. Apologize to your sister for putting glue in her hair. I'm sorry. Jenny, tell him you forgive him. I forgive you. Now you guys hug it out. That's the childlike understanding of forgiveness. And that childlike understanding still works as adults in certain situations. If we step on somebody's foot in a restaurant, that works. If you use your wife as a sermon illustration without her permission, not that I would know anything about that, but it works in that circumstance. But this view of forgiveness falls apart in the messiness of family, where sometimes the hurt's really deep, and there's bitterness that's been there for months or years. What is accurate about our childlike understanding of forgiveness is that there's two parts to forgiveness. But it's not the apology and the acceptance. The two parts of forgiveness are before and after. That's it. That's the two parts of real forgiveness is before you've forgiven and after you've forgiven. If you can understand that, that will change your life. If you can understand that, it will transform your relationship that you're struggling in. Understanding the before and after, because if you haven't forgiven yet, you understand the before. The before is filled with hurt and bitterness and disillusionment and frustration. You can feel in your chest, feel in your shoulders, just the tightness when you think about what was done wrong to you. Or even when you think about that person you may love and you think about that moment, you can feel that. The before keeps you from experiencing the good things around you. It keeps you from being the husband that you should be, or the wife that you should be, or the parent or the child that you should be, or the friend that you should be. It keeps you from your very best. It keeps you from the relationship you should have with Jesus, because you know deep down that you need to forgive, but you just can't do it. You just can't bring yourself to that. Forgiveness for wrongs in marriage and family, it isn't always easy, but it has to happen for love to flourish. No matter what's been done to you, no matter how bad it was, you can forgive. And when you do that, if you can do that, it will change everything. Because here's the thing, what was done wrong may have been really bad, it may have been really hurtful, but your bitterness does not make it any more right. And if you can let it go, if you can let that anger and frustration and lack of forgiveness go, it'll change everything. Forgiveness sets us free. Check out this video.
Hi, my name is Don Cloyd, and this is my wife, Michelle. We have been married for 23 years, and we have been with Karis City since the beginning, which has been approximately 1 year now. Growing up, I did not know Jesus. I grew up without him in my life. I did not know who God was. I started drinking at a very early age. One night at work, a friend of mine came up and introduced me to what Jesus actually, who he is and what he has done for us. And it changed my life briefly for about 9 months. After 9 months of a wonderful change, I went back to my old ways. I started drinking again.
It was hard. I threatened to leave several times, but I didn't want to because we both come from divorced families, and I didn't want that for our kids. And so, I mean, it was very, very difficult.
It was May 2011. I was sitting at a bar one night with a couple of buddies of mine, and in that moment I was drinking a beer in a clear glass, and I was about halfway done with it when all of a sudden I got it about halfway, and I was taking that sip and looking in the bottom of that glass, and all of a sudden a voice spoke to me and said, "There's nothing in the bottom of that glass for you." And at that moment, that same voice spoke to me and said, "Go home and be with your family." So after I put that beer down, I looked at it and I smiled because I knew something was changed. There was something different that was happening in my life at that moment. I knew that I was never going to touch alcohol again. So I texted my wife during the day at work and talking about how much I love you and stuff. Will you love me forever? And she said, "Well, we've got to talk tonight. How about if we go to dinner?" I was like, "Perfect, let's go to dinner." So we did. We went to Saltgrass and we're sitting down to have a nice meal, and I looked at her and I said, "Baby, you're not gonna believe this. I quit drinking. I can't explain it, but that was it. I'm done. There is no more drinking. It is awesome."
Yeah, at that point I was like, oh, great, you know, this is another promise that you're not gonna keep because he's done this before. And so I was like, yeah, okay, good for you. But I filed for divorce. All the anger and the resentment and the hurt and was pent up, inside me. I even went outside our marriage, had a relationship outside of our marriage. So I threw all that on the table at him, just everything I could think of, just to hurt him and lash back at him.
I believe I started reading the Bible. I started reading the Gospels, and I realized what Jesus had done. Forgiveness. He always talks about forgiveness. So in the moment that I found out that she had stepped out of the relationship, I looked at her and I told her straight up, "I forgive you, and I forgive him. And I'll do anything that I can, and I just want you to know that I forgive you, and I just pray that you can forgive me for everything that I have done."
One weekend, and he decided to go, this is before I even forgave him, Um, I was like, I just want to be alone. I just want to be alone because I left alone. And so he said, I'm going to take the kids to Galveston with some friends of ours. And I was like, good, go, because I don't want to be around you, you know. And he did, and I'll never forget it because, you know, it was as loud as day. A voice in my head said, you want to be alone, this is what alone's like. And I just felt empty, like it was just, there was nothing. There was a big, huge void there. And I was like, for whatever reason, I'm like, no, I don't want this. I don't want to be alone. So that's, to me, that was when I think the major turning point for me was at that point saying, okay, and when he came home, I was like, okay, we'll do this, you know.
At a moment that we were about to end our relationship, God brought it back together in a way that only He can. There is no other explanation for how we could go through the things that we did. Forgiveness is definitely a game changer.
Yeah.
But the forgiveness that we're talking about is a godly forgiveness. Because without Him at the center of it all, forgiveness really meant nothing before the things that we went through. It took us going through those moments to really learn what forgiveness is through the eyes of God.
Before it was, you have a suitcase and you pack it full of stuff and it's bulging at the seams. And once we forgave, it opened up and everything was released. I think I felt light. I feel more at peace than I did before. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it's definitely worth the fight.
Forgiveness may be the hardest thing you have to do in your relationship. But if you remind yourself of what you've been forgiven of, that Jesus forgave you before you earned it, before you said you were sorry, before you made it right. In fact, you can't make it right, and yet He forgave you. If you can forgive, it will change everything. And I mean that. It will change your relationship with God. It will change your relationship with whoever you're struggling with bitterness for. The reality is this: we will have conflict in any close relationship. It's going to happen. How we deal with that conflict goes a long way to deciding whether we're going to have a happily ever after in this life or not. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, I thank you first for my wife. I thank you for the